are we more race conscious, or should we be beyond where we are in terms of discussion? Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the challenges that we have is the perception of racism has become big business. Billion-dollar big business. You know, it's one thing to talk about racism, but it's another to talk about this perception of racism, because the perception of racism business is where you find all black leaders today, well, except maybe two in the Congress, Tim Scott and me alone. But this perception of racism business is what shakes down corporations at $450 million like Jesse Jackson did to Toyota, $650 million like they did to Nissan, to where now even the corporate world is emboldened to say racism is always a factor. So yes, we are much more conscious. And then we had 8 years of a president who made sure that everything he saw was through a racial lens. And so it's divided us tremendously. We're making gains to get ourselves healthy. In fact, the civil rights movement was one. The barriers were removed, which is what Dr. King wanted. Dr. King's movement was about repentance and revival. But this new generation of this social justice generation, they want revenge and redistribution. And that only comes through feeding into this narrative that racism is everywhere. If you remember, during the 60s, there was much debate about King's movement versus Malcolm X's movement. I mean, there are some people that want revenge. They want vengeance. They do not want to become American or Americanized. They're just the hatred is that embedded. But you don't find that in the black evangelical Christian world, or you don't find that in the black Catholic world. What you find are people that are really trying to reconcile ourselves to America. This is our country too. But that messaging is often met by the hard black left that drives people like Black Lives Matters that do not want integration. They do not want a place where everybody just says, why should I hate all white people because you do? And then they get mad at you for not hating all white people because they do. So that comes down to spiritual questions. And with the God that we could win that battle as well, because I think that most Americans, and particularly that millennial generation, they don't want to have to buy that narrative, but it's so pushed into our schools now that if you don't divide up right away, you have real challenges. Black youth are almost forced into this black narrative and hatred if they want any friends, and it starts really early. And that's one of the reasons that we really need school choice, so that people that just want to live free can. You want to call me a sellout? Fine. You want to call me an anti-Semite? Fine. You name it, I'm it. Don't worry about it. But I study enough black history to know that most of their narrative about what really happened during the time of black struggle is a lie, and that the truth is on my side. When you look at most of the black leaders during the time of even abolitionists and others, they had Christianity in their lives, they loved capitalism, and they appealed to the Constitution. These are the three things that make America really, really work well throughout the world, and has forever. And they work for blacks. That if you have Christianity and you have a capitalistic society and you have a constitution that protects your interest, I'm not mad at that. So Black Lives Matter can be mad if they want to. I just don't like that they're just insistent on indoctrinating black people that do not want to adopt those values.
Those of us who aren't black, tell us about what it feels like to be under intense hate and intimidation and pressure because you believe and espouse things that the left's orthodoxy rejects. What does that feel like? Tell us more.
Well, you know, it is incredible the length that they go to make sure that, in particular, the black community doesn't hear both sides of the political questions of the day, the cultural questions of the day. And so all of us, if you are black and you're a conservative, deal with a lot of intensity. But over the last couple of years, it's gotten even worse. So in fact, in my personal life, I just had to move. I have to rent my home to move into a more private quarters that is not accessible to the alt left. It's a lonely life often. Most blacks find it even in their family. But I come up with solutions to these things. First, I don't debate liberals unless they're paying me. And I also told my family members that want to go after me for my belief in a different worldview that I debate for a living. So when I see your checkbook, I'll answer that question. And so it kind of keeps the tensions away from at least my family reunions and and the funerals. But it is a legitimate concern. And should be for many, even outside of the black community, what black conservatives have to go through to promote a biblical worldview in our society today.
In the midst of everything you do, what gives you strength and hope, Starr?
Well, my strength comes from the Lord. You know, for people that don't know my personal story, I had believed all the lies of the left. I had believed that the poor were poor because the wealthy were wealthy, that my problems were somebody else's fault, that America was so racist, I didn't need to mainstream, all of the things we keep hearing over and over and over again, and I believed them and ended up in a very reckless living patterns, from criminal activity to drug activity to sexual activity to welfare dependency. And after a Christian conversion, I changed my life. So my first hope is in the Lord. So I get up and I make sure I stay in the proverb a day and I read a psalm a day. But over and above that, my strength in the movement is because I know that a third of Black Americans agree with me. The pollsters have shown us for the last 30 years that 1/3 of Black people keep saying they're evangelical and conservative. So I know I'm not alone. We don't hear from them at all, but I hear from them quietly. I hear from them in letters. I hear from them in emails saying, I would never say that out loud, but you go, girl. So that encourages me that I'm not just a spokesperson or a vocal for the alt-right, as some will write me with their hate mail and tell me that, you know, I'm a puppet for the evangelical white right wing. No, actually, a third of Blacks agree with us. I did an audience at a college, and the girl that ran the local Planned Parenthood was in the audience, which I didn't know until after, and she came up to me in tears and told me she was quitting her job after what I said. One girl in particular I met after a presentation for the Crisis Pregnancy Center banquet that I was in town for, and she was the help service, and she came up to me later and said, you know, I know these people, and she said, I went there, and of course then I take a deep breath because I didn't know the outcome. I said, so what happened? She said, my daughter is now 8 years old. The stories are long, because what happens, even when my audience is all white, the help is not, and so they stay and they listen, and then their lives change. I got one letter from a girl that told me that after she heard me speak there, she cursed me. She wanted me to die because I was singing her life. I talked about myself and drugs and other in welfare and, you know, just recklessness, and she was identifying with it. And the reason that she wrote me is because she wrote, now I'm sober, now I'm, you know, back in college, and I just want you to know this. This was years later, and she's following me. So yeah, you know, I've heard that all over the place. I cursed you, but now I love you. So God's touching people, and I'm convinced that when people hear truth, they grow and they learn and they recognize it. And actually, that's one of the reasons that I think the left works so hard for the general marketplace not to hear truth, because they know that deep down inside people recognize truth, and that's why they don't want the alternative voice on the campuses. They don't want us in the public square. They don't want that messaging, because they know that people, if they hear it, they will recognize truth.
So in the Black community, what destroys values and the institutions of the Black family, as opposed to what sustains it and fortifies it?
Welfare. People want to pretend it's slavery, a legacy in slavery, that it's Jim Crow. No, welfare. That's what destroyed Black family. In 1970, when you look at just in general life in America, in 1970, 40% of American households were husband, wife, children. Today it's 18%. In 1970, only 7% of children were born in homes with an unmarried mother. 7% in the 70s. Today, that number is 48%. Blacks moved from 22% out of marriage births to 72% today. Whites moved from 3% to 30% today, which is why we see some of the social pathologies that we thought were confined to our hard-hit zip codes in the middle class, because it's marriage. That's the social stabilizer. And since Black marriage has collapsed as a result of the welfare state, Black boys and girls are growing up without the glory of their father, is what it really comes down to, as the scripture says. You know, when you have 30% of Black adults married, this is not healthy for that community. It affects you economically, educationally, and it affects crime. When you look at Black family life where the husband is married to the mother of children, and white family life where the husband is married to the mother of children, you can't even measure the economic differences, the educational difference, or the crime differences. No, marriage is what collapsed, and that's the reason that Black life is in despair. You know, I've talked often about the difference between Simone Biles and Michael Brown. We both know those names now nationally. Michael Brown died in Ferguson. Simone Biles went and got us the gold. Their set of circumstances upon their birth were similar. They were both born into chaos. Their families were broken down. The difference in their two lives is that Michael Brown, 2 weeks before he died in Ferguson, received a high school diploma from a school that he was forced into that had lost its accreditation. He received a worthless piece of paper. Simone Biles was adopted by her granddad and sent to private school, private Catholic school. Then she was homeschooled and she went and got the goal. No, public policy impacts behavior, which then changes opinion. So we have to change the law so that people can live free. I believe public policy changes behavior. We would not have 1 million abortions if it weren't legal. People look at the law and say, well, then it must not be immoral. Well, no, people weren't killing their children in the womb. Are you kidding? This was unheard of. You didn't even think about doing it. But when the law changed. So when the law also changed on how we deal with poverty in our country, we started paying people to not marry. When I lived on welfare, the rules were and still are, don't work, don't save, don't get married, and we'll kind of keep you enslaved to a poverty plantation. We'll tell you where to educate your kids, we'll tell you where to live, the list is long. You have to change that policy so people will self-govern. This country is about self-government. That entire redistribution system is inconsistent with the founding of this country, freedom and personal responsibility. So we must do what not only Paul Ryan wants to do, but now what the president is saying he wants to do to fix the inner cities, which means dismantle the welfare state. Get this stuff out of Washington and back into local communities where local people can be involved in the lives of those that are broken. Get educational choice so people can go to schools where they build moral frameworks.
So it is a siren song that the left sings to people. What seems to be effective that you use when you go out and speak to people, other than your personal story, to pull people away and to plant those seeds of truth?
Well, not just when I go out, but in my work at CURE and as well as in the media. We have threefold. We have media, we have a policy center, and we have a clergy network. And through those three programs, I talk about more than just my personal story. I actually convey to them the conservative principle that drives the policy changes that we want, that we from the right want in Washington, that Republicans represent in why it is that we're saying we want a limited role of government. And it resonates. Like, for instance, on the last debate over Medicaid. Medicaid is not working, and the first people to know it are the people on it. And so you have to go out there and let them know, not just that it's not working, which they already know, but what is the alternative? What would work for their lives? And that's why I'm able to connect with the people that we're often discussing here in DC, because I understand what needs to be done on educational choice. These parents know they don't want their kids trapped in those failing schools, but they don't understand that there's a Blaine Amendment in the way that keeps them from having the opportunity for the money to follow their child to the school they want. That these are things we have to change in the public square and in law. One of the things I think the left has on the right is that they understand that public policy changes behaviors. And the behaviors they want, secularism and big government, they have passed laws. Notice that everything that the left has done to destroy this country has been through force, because law is force. So what they've done is they've gone through the court systems for everything from removing prayer from the schools to making sure that we don't have any gender specific laws, to making sure that people can kill in the womb. I mean, everything, all the law of, somehow they found in the general welfare clause this expansion of the nanny state and force now all of us to be involved in this big redistribution machinery. Did you know that the anti-poverty programs alone are a quarter of our budget? Most people can't even name one of the anti-poverty programs, but it's a quarter of the budget. It's $900 billion. So this is what they've done through law. So law then over time changes behavior. When you tell someone an able-bodied cannot be in your home because you're poor and you need help, next thing you know, the marriage doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't make sense to marry. So what the right has to do is begin to reshape law to the intent of the founders. The founders knew that you wanted a limited role of government. They said if we didn't mention it here, then it should be done in the states. So that means that the things that were not mentioned in the Constitution that the federal government should be doing are the things that this new administration should make sure through their departments that they are dismantling.
So Starr, I've seen the conservative movement as a whole. I don't see anyone like you and CURE who's out in the community as you are. Maybe I'm wrong. And I know George Soros just gave $18 billion away. How do you survive, and how much support do you have and do you need?
I think that that's the difference right there. I'm not the only one. There are a lot of decent people in quiet communities doing the most amazing work, African Americans included, that are in the grassroots doing the work with the same voice. It's just the funding. When you don't have the money, George Soros understands that. He understood that, that Black Lives Matters, they can get bigger and they can go. And that's what they do. The left, when they see a outspoken personality, they fund them so that then they can run them for office. And the right just doesn't do that. We're not equipped yet. We don't even have the people waiting. My think tank, for instance, I would love for CURE to be like what they did with that American Center for Progress, or whatever they call that thing, which is a holding tank for the left until the next job space becomes available. So as people want to say, well, it can't just come down to money. Sometimes things do. Sometimes it just comes down to you need a capital infusion in a good business idea to make it take off. So while I am one of the leading organizations, you're absolutely right. In fact, CURE is the largest policy institute national in the country that is pushing into these hard-hit communities ideas of conservatism. But there are others, and we partner with those others, and we love those others, and we're hoping that one day we will all be able to get not only that third of Black Americans organized and activated for the right, but also to reach into that middle that know that Jesse Jackson and all the rest of his children do not support that they don't support their ideas, but they haven't heard from the right. They haven't heard from us. And so therefore our work is extensive to make sure that they at least hear from us.
What is going on about anti-Americanism with the NFL? And I saw Stevie Wonder took a knee while he sang the national anthem the other day. What's moving through the Black community in particular?
Well, I think that there are many that still want to get to the answers of the questions that even Paul Johnson brought up in the history of the American people. Can we atone for our past? I mean, a brilliant country that was birthed when 20% of people were enslaved is a question that America should address, and attempted to, through law, through a welfare state, which was not the right answer. Some sins are just so egregious that you just don't do anything. And I think that that's what Frederick Douglass was appealing to when they said, but what are we going to do now with 4 million people who are now incorporated into American citizenship? He said, do nothing with them. If they fall, they'll get up. They're people. They're human. This is what we're saying here. They will be okay. But the guilt from the left, that perception of racism business began to grow and insist. The civil rights movement was about desegregation. It was not about forced integration. And so when the left got a hold of the civil rights movement after King's death, they took us into laws that force integration. This is not healthy for anyone. If there's nothing else we should have learned from the civil rights movement and from slavery, is that force is not an American ideal. So no more than should Black people have been forced into particular living patterns during the history of the country, should now we be forced to hand in hand with the secularists in laws, new things, whether it's transgender things or whether it's school things. Force is not an American ideal, or whether it's Obamacare, force is not an American ideal.